All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining Leveling Up Your Defenses, Health IT Security, and Risk Management webinar. My name is Jordan Leibniz, and I'm part of the marketing team here at IMO. Before we get started, I want to take care of a few items for those attending. First off, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to you for future viewing. Throughout the session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. So if you have any questions, type them into the questions section on your GoToWebinar console. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through a Q&A, but we'll get to as many questions as we can. But if for any reason yours is not addressed, we'll follow up with you after the presentation. Today, we have IMO VP of Enterprise IT and Security, Lori Kevin, and our Associate General Counsel, Nicole Pearce. As mentioned before, if you have any questions or comments while our presenters are speaking, type them in the questions section. And with all this being said, I'm going to pass it over to Nicole.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So we wanted to start off this presentation with a little bit of a scare slide. Not that there is any, not that we need any more scary news right now, but you know, we're all here to talk about security and specifically security and health IT. And so we wanted to start off with some statistics about kind of the current state of security in healthcare IT. So in 2021, cyber attacks in healthcare were up 71%. Ransomware specifically, which is the act of a cyber criminal getting into your system, locking you out and demanding a ransom to let you back in, that cost the world $20 billion in 2021. And that number is expected to rise to $265 billion by 2031 in 10 years. That's extraordinary growth. We're hearing from the FBI that 75% of the current ransomware attacks are being used to try to fuel the war in Ukraine on behalf of Russia. So it's like we're living in our very own James Bond movie, and it's terrifying. Recovering from a ransomware attack could cost you, $1.85 million on average in 2021, and that number is rising. If you are with a small or mid-sized organization, don't feel like you're immune. Eponymon Institute did a study that said small to mid-sized businesses are also experiencing these types of attacks. 45% of them say that they don't think their processes are effective in mitigating, and 66% of those polled had experienced some kind of cyber attack in the past 12 months. So we were going to ask, as a level set, a question around your current maturity level. The group in this, the attendees here, if you want to, I think we're going to launch a poll.
Thanks a lot for that uplifting news, Nicole. But yeah, we would like to figure out, of those attending here, we'd love to start kind of figure out where you're at in your current security strategy from your perspective. Are you just starting your journey? There's nothing quite formalized, sort of an infancy level, or certainly not as mature. You've got things kind of mostly built, but there needs to be some refinement, there needs to be some more formalization. Or are you very mature? Do you feel like you've got your stuff together and are just kind of looking for new strategic ways in which to evolve your program? So let those kind of drive in. And I guess, Nicole, why don't you, as we kind of continue, and we'll come back to this to see the results, maybe what you can share is a little bit of IMO's privacy and security program and how we're structured.
Sure. From taking a step back, from the legal perspective, which is where I live and breathe, we have these two concepts of security and privacy, and a lot of times you hear them spoken about together, maybe even assumed to be the same, but they really are two separate concepts that complement each other really well. Security is really the protection of data against unauthorized access, use, or disclosure. We put security controls in place to limit, who and what can access data. Privacy as a concept is more about understanding the data that you have and how it should and shouldn't be used. And so, those two concepts, while different, really work together. Privacy ultimately informs what the security strategy should be. And so when you talk about, what defines our security and privacy posture at IMO, the first step is understanding the nature of the data that you have. And this would be the same of any company wanting to start understanding their privacy and security obligations. What is the data? Is it big D data or little d data? And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten into conversations with vendors or customers. We're going back and forth about data rights. And we haven't done the level setting of understanding what is the data that we're getting. Are we getting protected health information that's governed by HIPAA? Are we getting personal data? It's governed by state and federal privacy laws. Are we getting credit card data? Or does that mean PCI applies? It's really, really important to understand the nature of the data. Sometimes the data that you're getting is not going to be the crown jewels, and that will have a totally different security posture. So that's the first step. And then ultimately, what drives our process and posture? It's, you know, the kind of three prongs: the applicable law. So as we discussed, like something like PHI, HIPAA, high tech would apply. Is it going to be that state privacy law, GDPR in the EU, CCPA in California? That's always going to be the baseline, right? You have to do what's required by the law. But then it's your customer expectations. You know, as a service provider to the healthcare industry, you know, we have to react and be proactive about addressing our customers' concerns and their expectations about how to protect data. And I'll tell you that we're finding in the industry now, our healthcare customers and partners are asking us to go above and beyond what just the baseline of what applicable law is requiring, which is absolutely reasonable. And we need to keep up with industry best practices. What are our competitors doing? What are other leading market players doing? So those are all the things that we look to in determining the appropriate privacy and security posture for our company. You know, that also involves some analysis of what kind of audits and attestations. There's, you know, SOC 2 Type 2, there's ISO certification, there's HIPAA security risk assessments, high trust. I'm sure a number of you have heard these types of descriptions of audits and attestations, and all of those come into play. So now that we've established kind of what types of things you look to when determining your security posture, now, Lori, you know, specifically, how has IMO's program evolved using these factors?
Sure. Before I do that, Jordan, can you share with us the results of the poll as to where everybody's at?
All right. A lot of folks midstream. That's great.
Yeah. So that's good. So this will be, hopefully we'll have some questions and dialogue at the end here where we can kind of discuss, answer any other questions. So as far as IMO's security evolution, I joined the company almost 3 years ago. And when I joined, it was security was definitely a component of a lot of what we did, right? We're healthcare IT, it has to be. But there was no formalized kind of security program. And so I worked really closely with Nicole when I first started. And what I found as I kind of did analysis over all aspects of the organization is that there were a lot of things that were being done correctly. There was a lot of awareness. There were decent policies. There were some understanding of controls, but nothing really formalized. And so really the biggest thing that we found in that first kind of year as I kind of worked through this was starting to understand the documentation and overall management and ownership of our operational controls. And so the big thing there was to find a tool where we could keep all of this and capture all of this and then make sure we can start to engage the other members of the organization. Because as I'm sure hopefully most folks on this call are kind of aware or help to promote, security, my role as managing our information security program is I'm going to provide you guys the guidance and I'm going to suggest some tools, I'm going to suggest some policy. But at the end of the day, I don't typically own most of those controls, right? That's going to be on our HR organization or our software engineers. So it was important for us to figure out what those controls were and then apply those to the appropriate policies that we could then promote to the entire organization. So publishing those was quite an ordeal. And again, we engaged kind of representation across all departments within the organization to make sure that, we were trying to understand, this is your control, these are your processes. We need you to really own that documentation. Security and awareness and training were huge, right? So there's the standard, everyone's getting the security training as they join the company and annually thereafter. But we really wanted to figure out how we were doing on overall metrics of that type of awareness? What is, the aptitude of individuals? What departments may need some additional training? What kind of role-based training do we need? We work really closely with compliance to make sure that we understand what those things are and try to evolve that as well. And as I stated, the cross-department collaboration is absolutely key. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into our risk management program. But our evolution was really to understand, we actually conducted a readiness assessment for SOC 2 that really helped us to identify gaps that we may have had and to really formalize the program in a meaningful way. So that was really, really important for us to figure out, where we had gaps, what we needed to do, and to come up with a plan to remediate. So that's a lot of talk about the controls. I'm sure most folks on here are familiar with that, and the key there being, hey man, let's make sure that all of our controls actually represent such that we are doing what we say we do, right, as part of either our controls or our policy. So I talked a little bit about risk, and Nicole, I'm wondering if maybe you can, besides the controls, let's talk a little bit about risk mitigation. Maybe you can walk us through the risk management piece.
Sure. Well, in terms of other ways, other than working through how to mitigate risk from a security control perspective, we also have a couple of other mechanisms on the legal side that we can focus on to mitigate risk. And that's, typically 3 areas. Insurance, cybersecurity insurance is really, really important. When you're talking about mitigating risk of a potential security incident, there's a lot that goes into identifying, the appropriate insurance policy. If you don't have one, you should, start thinking about it, and making sure that you understand how much you have, what's covered. If you have some kind of a ransom demand, if that's something that your insurance would pay, the types of vendors that would be covered, what kind of damages would not be recoverable. That's really important. The second way we would mitigate risk, other than the security controls, is in our contracts with our customers and our vendors. Obviously, with customers, we want to have reasonable conversations about allocation of risk. And if there are legal folks or procurement folks on the phone, you want to, talk offline about how to have those conversations with customers and vendors. I've had some war stories, and they're not always great conversations to have, but they're important that you're not taking on so much risk that you putting your company in jeopardy. With vendors, see what their obligations are in the case of some kind of security incident. Shift risk where appropriate. Ensure that they have cyber insurance and that you have seen a certificate of insurance that evidences that. If in the third, and I think is the most important part of this additional risk mitigation, is creating a culture in your organization where security is prioritized. Just having Lori as a role, as a VP and as someone who is a figurehead in this organization for security matters, it goes so far in showing the organization that we're taking this seriously, creating engaging training materials, talking about security and privacy as a key objective of the organization and measuring it in a meaningful way, making sure product teams are engaging in security by design and not just asking the security folks to rubber stamp their designs. It's really important. And making sure, individuals in the organization are held accountable for security failures. This is, definitely hard, especially sometimes in startup environments and places where, people are encouraged to fail often to get to a more innovative solution. This is an area where you really need to hold people accountable. So I would say, you have all of these risks, the security controls, you have the insurance, you have, culture, good contracts. How do we, from a risk management perspective, then take that and turn it into a program that you can continuously review and measure those risk activities?
Yeah, so if we look at our overall kind of gaps as we kind of started out the formalized security program, we didn't really have anything that was addressing risks specifically. We kind of did indirectly, but not anything that was very formalized. And the biggest thing we wanted to do is make sure we were promoting communication, or we're communicating those risks and making sure that the right level of leadership, quite frankly, had awareness of it so that we could identify and address it via the things that you just discussed, Nicole. So, whenever I'm answering security questionnaires, one of the things is always, do you have an annual risk assessment? Do you have risk management? Are you assessing risks on an annual basis? And as Nicole and I kind of kicked off the risk management program, we really thought a lot about that and figured that, risk is not a once a year type of thing to analyze. It's not a once a year meeting. Everybody comes in, we talk about it and high five and everybody's on their way. So a lot of the language in our policy and our controls, we wanted to change to continuous review. And the way that we did that was we gathered, again, our cross-team collaboration so that we had a meaningful risk management committee. And that team is made up of myself on security. I also manage enterprise IT, Nicole from a legal and compliance perspective. And then we have representation across HR, our software engineering, our product management, our kind of intellectual property developers that we have there, finance, certainly, to make sure that we're looking at things holistically, right, across the entire enterprise. What are the things that would put us at risk? So our first step was to go in and, again, using the tooling, track those risks and do so in a way that we could get that input across the entire organization. So that was an exercise that was pretty lengthy. We kind of started out with out-of-the-box things that were available based on the software that we had selected. But then we also started to put in our own custom and IMO-specific risks that we had identified. And the nice thing about that was you want to always be looking at risk in a couple of different ways. One, we want to identify the risk and then figure out what's the likelihood that the risk will actually occur. And that's where the discussion comes in, right? We want to make sure we have perspectives across the entire organization. And once we identify the likelihood, what's the impact of if it were to happen? And so that kind of combination, the product of those two things would actually help us identify how severe the risk may actually be to us as an organization. So, we get that list and those are all tracked via our risk registry. And the important thing there is to make sure we then understand, well, okay, let's say we've identified, 40 risks. Of those, which are the ones that are truly still outstanding? Because as we talked about defining our controls, what we should have found, or what you should find in your organization, is you have the appropriate controls in place that mitigate those risks. So then there was the next step into making sure that we understood specific controls that we could tie to those risks that would reduce that kind of inherent risk, right? That combination of likelihood and impact. And so once we completed that exercise, it left us with kind of a comfort level or an appetite, right? A tolerance of what our risk looked like. And we did have a list of, say, top, 5 that may be things that we need to harden, we need to improve upon. I can share, one of the risks that we have in our registry that I assume is in everyone's, and it's kind of ongoing. It's not anything that ever says that we can ever say like, yep, we're all set. Is kind of on the education awareness. It's kind of those phishing attempts, right? So making sure we know that never before has there been more attempts with threat actors trying to get at your resources, right? And a lot of that is through, hey, let me send this that looks pretty legitimate and have an employee click on it. So that's one that we're continuously looking at. And again, that's where that continuous review comes in. And we are remediating that through things like monthly phishing campaigns. We kind of gamify it a little bit to where we have awards for people who submit the fact that they've caught a fish. And so you can see the list of trophies back here for winners, which is a kind of a fun way to make sure we're engaging the organization, right? In October, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we kicked off a number of initiatives, kind of scavenger hunts for policy and some reminder sessions on phishing and a lot of things that we could do to help combat that. So while kind of that social engineering risk will always kind of be around, we did, as a result of that, really sit down and figure out what we needed to do to at least reduce the risk, perhaps not mitigate it completely, but what are some other ways in which we can make sure we're protecting our resources and that our employees have that awareness, right? And I think the communication that we have there on the risk side is it's everybody's responsibility, right? We want to make sure that we're providing that guidance and information and education, but it's everyone's responsibility and role to make sure they're protecting it. Nicole mentioned a little bit about audit and attestation. I mentioned that we had initially conducted a SOC 2 Type 1 engagement, and prior to that did a readiness assessment. And that was certainly helpful for us to identify those gaps. Having a third party come in, help us with our definition of our controls, making sure we were thinking about things in the right way, certainly from a risk perspective, and then what we could do to fill in those gaps and make sure we were ready for the actual audit and attestation. We're combining that now with the HIPAA risk assessment, and so that's something that we're doing annually. And what's really driving that too is a lot of what we think are certainly applicable for our organization, but also what our customers are asking for. So, that is where we're at from what we're committing to within our contracts with our customers today. We know very well that as our product evolves, we're going to have to make adjustments, and some of those things that Nicole had mentioned, as things change within the business, we may have to go through GDPR, we may have to go through ISO. So those are things that we continually look at, and again, from a risk perspective, make sure that we're looking at what type of evaluations make the most sense for us. So that's a little bit about our risk program. It's been up and running for quite a while. It's pretty, the nice thing about it now is we meet on a monthly basis and things are moving along pretty well. And so I think that continuous review is something that we are constantly looking at, so that it's not just a once a year kind of thing and going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we also, another critical part of the risk management program is our constant engagement with our executive team and even our board in some circumstances. We make a determination about those risks, and we have kind of our top 10 that keep us up at night. And we report that up to our ELT, and they might come down and have totally different perspectives of those risks and tell us, hey, that one, we're not as sure that that's such a high priority. And so that communication is really important and something that we've established as well. Because that, you go through a lot of work implementing all of this, and then have your executive team say, oh, actually, well, what about this risk? Or, these three actually don't bother me very much. So that's a really important part of it as well. I mean, so it's one thing to establish, what you've described kind of, Lori, in these last 10 minutes, it's about 2.5 years worth of work, and you did a really great job of summarizing it. We having this robust program to prevent security incidents and having all of those additional ways to mitigate risk. What ultimately happens if someone or something gets through? What we're seeing now is it's not really a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So how does that instant response work?
Yeah, so that's been a huge focus. If we go back to the very first slide that Nicole presented, it's scary stuff, right? It is as we talk about making sure that we're communicating up to our leadership team and having our executives, weigh in on things, it's kind of okay, all of the department leads, let's get together. Like, what are the things that are keeping you up at night? And some sort of security incident is certainly at the top of mind for a lot of folks. So, incident response is important because we want to make sure that it's not, from an IMO perspective, when we have an issue, when we have something that kind of needs all hands, there's no question we've got the right people that are going to come in and they're going to work till it's fixed, right? But the preparation is really what is absolutely key. So first and foremost, you got to make sure on the security incident response team that people are aware that they're on this incident response team, right? So primarily, certainly there's going to be members of security, depending on the incident, and that depends on a lot of your monitoring and auditing and paging that you have configured and set up. We want to make sure that there are, pathways and channels of communication. If it's customer facing and it's in our products, well, we need to make sure we're getting software engineering engaged. If it's our enterprise products or applications, something like Office 365, we need to make sure our enterprise IT is engaged. And if it's worse than that, right, if it actually gets into a potential breach, something like that, then that's where we really want to make sure our executive management is engaged as well as legal, so that we understand the steps that we need to take. Part of the big thing that we want to make sure we have is that very locked down and specific internal and external communication. So that is the methods that we're using to communicate, and we have to think of what's the backup to the backup. What are the things that we need to have in place to make sure that we are getting the notifications and communications out to the key stakeholders, our customers, our employees, our teams that need to investigate, in a timely manner and with enough information, but not too much information, that we can make sure we know what we're looking at. So a lot of that, I think, Nicole, you can talk about the tabletop exercise in a little bit. We can talk about where we're at with that and how we're kind of tackling what those communication methods look like. On the incident triage and investigation, then obviously we want to make sure we have the right tooling in place, right? So how do we even know that an incident occurred? Well, I think, I would always suggest that we want to make sure that we're notifying people of the incident before they're notifying us. So it's really, really important that ahead of this process, we are thinking about the different ways in which an incident may occur, and that we're putting the lock and key around that so that we have all of the detection tools in place so that teams are woken up in the middle of the night. We are getting these communications, pagers are going off, and we're engaging that security incident response team. And that is a very, timely process, but one that's incredibly important, because if you don't have the right alerting within all of the different entry points within your network or within the infrastructure, you will eventually have someone, a customer or something, tell you that you're down, and that's certainly not a way you want to, the way you want to operate. So the triage and investigation is really those playbooks, right? Whether it's disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, it's making sure that it's very quick to point to this playbook to go in and start the restoration process. And then, a lot of times too, you can imagine, and I know that I'm sure this is the case across the board, we're using a lot of third parties. So for integration purposes, for support, we're using AWS from a cloud perspective. We really have to analyze all of the third-party tools that we're using. Are they tied into SSO? What's their recovery point objective and the recovery time objective? What vulnerabilities do they have? I mean, we've certainly seen in the past year vulnerabilities that have popped up across a number of different technologies that we're leveraging. And so, let's make sure, one, we're aware and communicated to when those are discovered, and address them, very specifically. But it was really an opportunity for us as well to take a look at, from a continuity perspective, what are the critical business functions that are important to IMO, and what are the dependencies? Do we have third parties there that, if this were to go down, what is the results? And then really think about prioritizing, again, that risk, right? That likelihood and impact, and having us prioritize those things that would really take us out of the water, and start to chip away at the most important or the critical things in a way that would help us get to restoration and continue to reduce the risk that we have with any of those dependencies. So I mentioned a little bit, but Nicole, you you really kind of kicked off this great exercise for us where we did a tabletop. We brought in a bunch of folks in the office. So maybe walk our audience through that, because it was a really good experience.
Sure. Yeah, we specifically, as a result of all of the uptick in ransomware attacks that we've seen, felt that we needed to step up our game in that area. And so we worked with our outside security and privacy counsel that we've been working with for a very long time. She knows our business, to create some scenarios. And we brought the members of this security incident response team together, along with some other support roles. None of us knew the scenario in advance. We were all in a room, and she just laid it out for us. Hey, this cyber attack is happening. This is the impact on your systems. What do you do? And we called it Lynn's escape game. It felt like we're all together in an escape room trying to solve this puzzle, and it was terrifying and exhilarating. And it was a really great opportunity for the team to actually look at a potential real world scenario, think about what resources they would need, who they would need to call, how they would need to interact with, how we would need to interact with each other. To Lori's point, what are the backup systems to the backup systems? If your products are unavailable and you can't get into Salesforce, how are you going to communicate with your customers? Do you have everyone in the security incident response team's cell phone number? Whose conference bridge are we going to use if Teams is down? So it was a really, really valuable exercise. It was challenging and it was fun. And what we got out of it was, one, we have a great team, and folks were eager to collaborate and problem solve. And I think having the opportunity to do this in a safe space when there's not actually a ransom being demanded is really, really helpful, because you get a chance to practice before you have to go into, hopefully never have to go into this real world scenario, but in reality, a lot of folks will. we found out what worked well, what didn't. We sat there and had a running list of takeaways, things that we would need to further investigate, understand. To Lori's point, what are our critical dependencies? Was there something that we missed on the list when we were just thinking about it? And our partnership with our outside counsel is really important. This is not, an incident response is not something that you necessarily, unless you're a massive company, that you wouldn't necessarily handle all in-house, right? You might have a PR crisis firm. You probably have someone help you with communications. You'd have forensic investigators. You would have potentially the FBI at some point if you decide to bring them in. And so walking through what could happen if somebody locked you out of your systems and said, okay, by the way, we're going to release all the data if you don't give us $10 million in 48 hours. Who would you have to talk to about that decision? Would you pay a ransom? Who would even make that call? Is that your CFO? Is that the board of directors? All of these are questions that you probably want to have the answer to before you have that demand in your inbox, because the clock is ticking. And not to add additional scares, but the folks that we work with for security and privacy, our counsel has paid, worked with companies that have paid tens of millions of dollars over the last couple of years in ransomware. And now I know when I started, I never thought we would be a company that would pay a ransom. I don't know. We'd have to, we have to work through all of those same questions, but there's a lot of factors that need to be considered. Can you back up your systems? Where would they come from? Are those housed separately from your existing operations? So all of those questions need to be answered. But it was a very, very valuable experience. And if you have an incident response plan and it has not been tested, I would recommend you do that very, very in short order, and use an expert. And if anyone needs a referral or any recommendations as to who might be willing to run one of those exercises, I'd be happy to share.
Yeah, Nicole, I would agree. I think we had so much positive feedback, and again, we had representation from departments across the organization, key stakeholders. What was really great to see is our executive leadership team also attended. So they kind of sat and observed and chimed in, here and there, but it was great to get that sponsorship from them as well, because it really is driving home that, hey guys, this is a priority and we need to be ready for it. And full disclosure, some of the things that came out was, from a security perspective, we have these policies. We have a security incident response policy. Folks are named in that policy. Emails were sent out that said, take a look at this doc. Well, that was a while ago, right? So it was sort of that reminder of, hey, this is your role, this is your responsibility. And now we've got so much engagement on this. We've got a dashboard, right, of all of the things that we kind of want to go and really harden, right, prove out. There were a lot of things that we found that were, gosh, we're crushing it right here. But then I think when it comes to kind of the communication and confirmation of the ways in which we'll communicate, those are some of the takeaways. But it was a great exercise. And again, I just reiterate that having that leadership sponsor is really key as well.
Yeah. And if you just need to find, I don't know about all of your organizations, we have a pretty large executive team, and finding just one ally on the executive team to help proselytize is not always the most exciting topics to talk about. Risk and risk management is just not as exciting as revenue generating activities. But when folks realize what's at stake, I think folks get engaged really quickly. And you can do it in a way that's not so tedious, right? You can do it in a way that's fun, and that is meaningful. And that's what we certainly experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. So to wrap up, that's kind of the key points that we wanted to talk about. But really, in the day-to-day, when Nicole and I are collaborating, when we've got, customer questions that are coming up, and we need to get on calls with customer and explain the nature of what we do, these are kind of the things that we communicate as far as the overall program. So first and foremost, understand the nature of your data. What are you capturing? What data elements are coming into your infrastructure? What's the life cycle of that data? Who has access to it, right? Do we need to make sure that we've got role-based security and kind of, least privilege, right? That whole approach to it. Again, very key to make sure everybody understands their roles and responsibilities. And you do this certainly through training, through those these types of exercises, right? Where you can, it's still hard to get everybody in a room at the same time, but there are these exercises that, again, need to happen to make sure that there's preparation and everybody is aware of what happens, what comes next. Test it. We can't say enough. We talked a lot about the incident response, but test it, even if it's tabletop, right? We don't have to go shut things down, but if you get sophisticated enough to look at technology partners that can help simulate that, even better, right? Understanding the risks that's probably been the biggest learning opportunity for us. Is the risk management really is the foundation for all of the security measures we put in place, for all of the mitigation, right? It's not just like check the box for SOC 2 because this control satisfies this requirement, but there's a risk behind that, and that's the reason why there are, those criteria, because it's there for a purpose to mitigate risk. And so that's something that I think has been a really great evolution of our security program. And then again, it's got to be continuous, right? This is not a once-a-year activity. There's review, there's remediation, there's promotion, right? There's making sure that everybody's on the same page when it comes to security. Everyone understands its priority. And, instead of it being this, okay, here comes Lori, we've got a security thing, it just starts to become muscle memory, right, across the organization, knowing we've got a huge responsibility as data custodians to protect it and to make sure that we're doing everything we can to secure our enterprise as well as our customers' data and their solutions too. So with that, Jordan, I'm going to turn it back over to you and go to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, we're going to start our live Q&A, so feel free to type your questions into the questions section. But in the meantime, we have a few that came in already. So how do you determine what audits and attestations you need for your organization?
Good question. I can take that one. When part of it is definitely client driven, I can tell you that there are certainly some language in contracts that are going to say we expect this attestation or audit or whatever the case, certification by this date. So that's a big driver. So a lot of it is really what our customers are requesting. And again, it's that review of our business and making sure that we are looking at those evaluations that make the most sense for us. For right now, we are committing to our SOC 2 and our HIPAA. High trust is something that comes up quite often. For us, we didn't want to pursue that because we felt that as though the SOC 2 was one that was standard, that it was something that was, again, requested by customers, and something that made sense for us in the kind of evolution of our program. High trust may very well become something that we will look into, but when we think about like resources and what is kind of that signature, that sign off from our third party, we're evaluating it in that way and not just, completing everything just for the sake of checking that box.
Yeah, I will just add that, from a applicable law perspective, we are business associates, so we do the HIPAA security risk assessment annually, and we do outsource that. We work with third party to do that. So that's really the only one that's required by law. We are not processing credit card data, so we don't have to do kind of PCI audits. I'm sure Lori's very excited about that. But it's whatever your industry that you're in, and if there's something that the law requires, obviously that's the baseline. But to Lori's point, then customers start asking, and you have to align on what's appropriate.
And I would add, you certainly need to consider all of the variables when you're thinking about it, right? SOC 2 is not cheap, depending on the vendor that you go through. You need to think about the criteria, right? We are focused on security, availability, confidentiality, and processing integrity. We don't have privacy as one because that's not really, we're not really retaining or processing personal information, and so that's one that we feel comfortable with saying no, we don't need to, because that adds another cost, right? So that is certainly a factor, and I think it's just part of the analysis of what makes the most sense for your organization.
Awesome. All right, another question came in. Is it possible to add some alerts as checks and balances when something slips through the phishing or ransomware demands, for example?
Can you repeat the first part of that, Jordan? I'm sorry, you were a little quiet.
No, it's okay. Is it possible to add some alerts as checks and balances when something slips through, like phishing or ransomware demands?
Yeah, for sure. So I can tell you what we have in place is a lot of tooling with third party for all of our phishing campaigns. And so that's part of the awareness of it. And we run reports and managers get those reports, as do our employees, as to what has passed or failed. If you're talking about actuals, we are kind of in an engagement currently or after the engagement and starting to do the roadmap work of Microsoft. So we're an Office 365 shop. There is a ton of security configurations and services that you can use from a Microsoft perspective to get those alerts. And so again, on top of all of that is we are working to understand the security components and modules within our tooling, and then making sure that we've got the right alerts over that to send out to our paging, our paging team, our pager application that alerts the appropriate teams when things like that happen. So from a phishing perspective, we have configuration set up already that will alert security team and they'll go and investigate. And in the ransomware case, I mean, we're looking at that same type of thing, right? We've got email kind of properties that we look at as well to make sure that those go to the right team, that typically security, and we have ways to contact us in the event that something does slip through.
Yeah, and if you're a user who's concerned, like, the spam filter isn't going to catch it, I mean, there's a lot of things you can look for, and a good security awareness training will help point those out. But I mean, one thing is like the banners that you see often on third party, this is outside, even if it looks like it's from your internal organization, there's a banner that Microsoft 365 can put on that email that says, this is actually from an outside, and if, I found looking and responding to email on your phone, pretty high risk. Like if you have any concerns about an email that came through and you want to double check to make sure it's not a phishing attempt, look at that on a desktop, hover over the from email and see that it's a legit from who you think it's going to be from. And when in doubt, you just need to report it or talk to your security folks about it. But there is no silver bullet for identifying a phishing attempt. It really is important to just slow down, and we all work really fast, myself included, but that's really what's required to prevent a successful phishing attempt.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Nicole. Within we do have the banners that just is plain and simple. Hey, this is coming from, the call is not coming from inside the house. And we err on the conservative side. So part of our workforce, is they're working in Salesforce all the time. They'll get alerts and notifications coming from Salesforce. Even though that is our instance of Salesforce, and even though, right, we should have some assurances that it is a true, legitimate notification, we're just not comfortable in taking that flag off, because who knows if there's some hijacking, right, over at Salesforce, or some threat actor that somehow gets in. We want to make sure that people are aware that it is not coming directly from IMO. So we have kind of stood firm on that. That has been something that has been requested, but until we can see a 0% failure rate month after month from a phishing campaign perspective, we're gonna keep our configuration as is.
Awesome. Where is the best place to start for a security plan?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's really just starting from the basics, right? Making sure you have the right, especially for your organization size, what makes the most sense as far as that security team. So first and foremost is make sure you have a dedicated individual or team that is responsible for it. Depending on the size, you got to understand your business, right? To understand, are you going to need internal audit? Do you need a dedicated security incident response team? Do you need specific, liaisons between your software engineers and your security team to provide those requirements? Do you have security embedded in software engineering? So it's really understanding the business to figure out what makes the most sense as to where to insert those security team members. The controls I can't say enough about. So once you have established and can understand it, and from the poll, it sounds like, hey, everybody mostly understands and they're just refining now. But we're constantly looking at those controls. We review our controls at least semi-annually with those control owners. We got to make sure that we're staying on top of, hey, does this still apply? Does this represent what we say we do? Because if not, that's a disconnect and we're going to put ourselves at risk. So the big thing I think is making sure you're having the conversations with the organization. You can make a lot of assumptions as a security leader and, kind of go forth. And then you get into an audit or you get into a client conversation and it is nothing like you had assumed. That is where getting the experts, which is the people who are doing the day-to-day and understand it all, can really help out, get you the documentation to present that. And then your review, right, is just going to be easier and easier each year. It's not going to be complete overhauls of things. It's establishing that baseline so that it starts to become easier and starts to become muscle memory, quite frankly, to do that review and to understand, how we're refining it and completing that in a way that's pretty efficient.
Awesome. All right, I think we're ready to close out for today. Nicole and Lori, thank you so much. You guys are awesome. And I feel much more secure that you guys are in charge of our security here. But we hope you found everything valuable in today's presentation. If you want any more information about IMO, please contact your IMO client executive or email sales@imohealth.com. Otherwise, please stay safe out there.
Thanks.
Thank you.